In the grand corridors of Ravenshire Palace, where centuries of royal portraits gazed down with painted eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 secrets, silence had never felt so deafening. The marble floors that once echoed with the laughter of royal children now seemed to absorb every sound, every whisper, every sob that threatened to escape from behind closed doors. Captain Marcus Sterling had served the royal family for 15 years, standing guard through celebrations and sorrows, through public ceremonies and private moments. He had seen kings crowned and queens mourned, had witnessed the birth of heirs and the weight of crowns passed from one generation to the next, but nothing in his years of loyal service had prepared him for what he would discover on this particular autumn evening, when the golden leaves outside mirrored the tears that would soon fall within the palace walls.
What happens when the strongest man in the kingdom becomes the most vulnerable?
When a father's love collides with a secret so devastating it threatens to shatter everything he holds dear? Sometimes the greatest battles are fought not on distant shores, but in the quiet corners of our own hearts, where no armor can protect us from the truth we fear most. This is the story of King Alexander Ravenshire III, a man who ruled a nation with wisdom and strength, yet found himself powerless against a discovery that would change everything he thought he knew about his beloved son, Prince Christopher. It's a tale of love, sacrifice, and the crushing weight of secrets that some families carry, even when the whole world is watching. The autumn rain hammered against the tall windows of Ravenshire Palace with an urgency that seemed almost desperate, as if nature itself was trying to wash away the secrets that had been buried within these walls for far too long. Captain Marcus Sterling adjusted his position outside the king's private study, his trained ears picking up the faint sound of movement from within. For the past 3 hours, King Alexander Ravenshire III had been locked away, refusing all visitors, all calls, all attempts at communication from his staff. Marcus had seen the king in many states over the years. He had witnessed him during the darkest days of his reign, when economic crisis threatened the stability of the kingdom, when political enemies circled like vultures, and when personal tragedies tested his resolve. But never had he seen Alexander like this. Never had he witnessed such raw, unfiltered anguish in the man who had always been the epitome of composure and strength. It had started earlier that morning when Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, the royal family's personal physician and longtime friend, had requested an urgent private audience with the king. Marcus remembered the way she had hurried through the palace corridors, her usually calm demeanor replaced by something that looked suspiciously like panic. Her hands had trembled as she clutched a manila folder against her chest, and her eyes had carried the weight of someone bearing news that would change everything. The meeting had lasted only 20 minutes, but those 20 minutes had somehow managed to transform a king into a broken man. Marcus had watched through the slightly ajar door as Dr. Hartwell placed her hand gently on Alexander's shoulder, speaking in hushed tones that carried the cadence of devastating revelation. He had seen the exact moment when the king's world shifted on its axis, when his face went from polite attention to confusion, from confusion to disbelief, and finally from disbelief to a pain so profound it seemed to physically bend him forward. When Dr. Hartwell left, she had paused at the door, looking back at Alexander with eyes full of sympathy and regret. "Your Majesty," she had said softly, "Prince Christopher doesn't know. The choice of what to tell him, when to tell him, remains yours." And then she was gone, leaving behind only the echo of her words and a king who suddenly seemed to carry the weight of the entire world on his shoulders. The folder now lay open on Alexander's mahogany desk, its contents scattered like pieces of a puzzle that no one wanted to solve. Medical reports, test results, specialist consultations, second opinions, third opinions, all pointing to the same devastating conclusion. The papers bore official letterheads from London's most prestigious medical institutions, each document a nail in the coffin of everything Alexander had believed about his son's future. Prince Christopher Alexander Ravenshire, second in line to the throne, beloved by the nation and adored by his people, was dying, not from an accident or an acute illness, but from a rare genetic condition that had been silently progressing for months, possibly years. The reports detailed a degenerative disorder that attacked the nervous system with relentless precision, breaking down the very foundation of motor function and cognitive ability. The prognosis was clear and merciless: 18 months, perhaps 2 years if they were fortunate. At 15 years old, Christopher should have been worrying about his upcoming exams at Thornfield Academy, about his first formal royal tour scheduled for the following summer, about the girl who had caught his attention at the last state dinner. Instead, his father now knew that he was facing a battle that no amount of royal privilege or medical intervention could win. Alexander remembered the last conversation he'd had with his son just 3 days prior. Christopher had been excited about his acceptance into the Royal Military Academy, following in the footsteps of his father and grandfather. His eyes had sparkled with the same enthusiasm that had once burned in Alexander's own heart at that age. He had spoken of his plans to serve his country, to prove himself worthy of the crown he would one day inherit, to make his father proud. "I want to be just like you, Dad," Christopher had said, using the informal address he reserved for their private moments. "I want to be the kind of king that people respect, that they trust to protect them and guide them. I want to make a difference." Those words now felt like daggers in Alexander's heart. How could he tell his son that there would be no military academy, no royal tour, no crown to inherit? How could he look into those bright, hopeful eyes and explain that the future they had planned together was nothing more than a cruel illusion? The king rose from his chair and walked to the window, watching the rain streak down the glass like the tears he refused to let fall. The palace grounds stretched out before him, perfectly manicured lawns and ancient oak trees that had witnessed the rise and fall of generations of Ravenshires. Somewhere in those gardens, Christopher was probably walking with his tutor, discussing history or literature, completely unaware that his own story was being cut short. Alexander pressed his forehead against the cool glass, closing his eyes as the weight of his newfound knowledge threatened to crush him. He thought about his late wife, Queen Isabella, and how she would have handled this situation. She had always been the stronger one when it came to emotional crises, the one who could find hope in the darkest circumstances and strength in the face of impossible odds. But Isabella had been gone for 5 years now, taken by cancer when Christopher was only 10 years old. Alexander had to face this alone. The irony was not lost on him that he commanded armies, signed legislation that affected millions of lives, and made decisions that could alter the course of history, yet he was utterly powerless to save the person who mattered most to him in the world. All his wealth, all his influence, all the resources at his disposal meant nothing in the face of genetics and biology. Dr. Hartwell's words echoed in his mind. "The choice of what to tell him, when to tell him, remains yours." But what kind of choice was that really? How do you tell a child that he's dying? How do you steal away his dreams, his hopes, his entire future with a few carefully chosen words? And yet, how do you not tell him? How do you watch him make plans and set goals knowing that he'll never achieve them? The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside drew Alexander's attention back to the present. He recognized the light, confident gait immediately. It was Christopher, probably returning from his afternoon tutoring session. The king held his breath, listening as his son paused outside the study door. "Father?" Christopher's voice came through the heavy oak, concerned and gentle. "Captain Sterling said you've been in there all day. Are you all right?" Alexander's throat constricted, making it impossible to respond immediately. How many more times would he hear that voice? How many more conversations would they have before the disease began to take away Christopher's ability to speak clearly? The medical reports had been explicit about the progression. First, the fine motor skills would deteriorate. Then, speech would become slurred. Then, "I'm fine, son," Alexander managed to say, his voice sounding foreign even to his own ears. "Just some state business that requires my attention." There was a pause, and Alexander could almost picture Christopher's face, the way his brow would furrow slightly when he sensed something was amiss but was too polite to pry further. "Well, don't work too late," Christopher said finally. "Cook is making your favorite lamb tonight, and I was hoping we could eat together. I have some stories from today's lessons that I think you'll find amusing." Alexander closed his eyes again, memorizing the sound of his son's voice, the casual affection in his tone, the simple pleasure he took in sharing his day with his father. These ordinary moments, which he had once taken for granted, now felt precious beyond measure. "Of course," Alexander replied. "I'll be down shortly." The footsteps receded, leaving Alexander alone with his devastating knowledge once again. He returned to his desk and began gathering the medical reports, handling each page as if it might crumble at his touch. These documents represented the end of everything, the death sentence of his beloved son, and yet they also represented something else: time. Limited, precious time that he could use to create memories, to say the things that needed to be said, to love his son with an intensity that might somehow make up for all the years they wouldn't have. As he placed the reports back in their folder, Alexander made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his days. He would not tell Christopher immediately, not today, not tomorrow, perhaps not for weeks or even months. He would give his son time to be young and hopeful and carefree for just a little while longer. He would bear the burden of this knowledge alone, would carry the weight of this secret until he found the right words, the right moment, the right way to shatter his son's world. The decision felt both merciful and cowardly, protective and selfish, but it was the only choice he could make while still being able to look at Christopher's face without breaking down completely. Alexander straightened his tie, smoothed his hair, and prepared to walk downstairs to have dinner with his son. He would smile, he would laugh at Christopher's stories, he would ask about his studies and his friends and his plans for the future. He would play the role of a father who didn't know that his child was dying, and he would do it so convincingly that Christopher would never suspect the truth. At least not yet. At least not tonight. But as he reached for the door handle, Alexander Ravenshire III, king of a proud nation and protector of millions, allowed himself one moment of complete vulnerability. He leaned against the door, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs, grieving for a future that would never come to pass and for the innocence that would soon be lost forever. Outside in the hallway, Captain Marcus Sterling stood at attention, his own heart heavy with the knowledge that something fundamental had changed within these palace walls. He had served long enough to recognize the sound of a man's world falling apart, and he knew that whatever had happened in that study would ripple through the royal family like an earthquake, changing everything in its wake. The rain continued to fall against the windows, washing the world clean, while inside the palace, the beginning of the end had already begun. 3 weeks had passed since Dr. Ralph Tucker Hartwell's devastating revelation, and King Alexander had become a master of deception. Each morning, he rose before dawn to review the latest medical consultations he had secretly arranged, speaking with specialists across Europe and America, desperately seeking a different opinion, a miracle that might change everything. Each evening, he sat across from Christopher at dinner, discussing politics and history and the future as if that future stretched out endlessly before them. The weight of the secret was crushing him slowly, methodically, like a vice tightening around his chest with each passing day. He found himself studying Christopher's face during their conversations, searching for signs of the disease's progression, cataloging every expression and gesture as if they might be among the last. The irony was cruel. The more he tried to preserve normalcy for his son's sake, the more abnormal everything became. Captain Marcus Sterling had noticed the change immediately. In their morning briefings, the king's attention often drifted, his responses delayed, his usual sharp focus replaced by a distant, haunted look. Alexander had always been a man who controlled his environment with precision, but now he seemed to be fighting a battle against an invisible enemy that he couldn't defeat or even acknowledge publicly. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in late October. Christopher had been complaining of headaches for several days, dismissing them as stress from his upcoming examinations. But when Alexander found him in the library, slumped over his desk with his study materials scattered around him, the careful facade finally began to crack. "Christopher?" Alexander approached his son cautiously, noting the pale complexion and the way Christopher's hands trembled slightly as he tried to organize his papers. "Are you feeling all right?" "Just tired, Father," Christopher replied, but his voice lacked its usual energy. "I think I might be coming down with something. Perhaps I should retire early tonight." Alexander helped his son to his feet, and for a moment Christopher swayed slightly, reaching out to steady himself against the desk. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but Alexander recognized it immediately from Dr. Hartwell's description of early symptoms. The disease was beginning to affect Christopher's balance and coordination, just as the medical reports had predicted. "Let me walk you to your room," Alexander offered, trying to keep his voice steady. As they moved through the corridors, Alexander found himself supporting more of Christopher's weight than usual. His son's steps were slightly unsteady, and twice Christopher paused to rest against the wall, claiming dizziness from studying too hard. Each stumble felt like a knife through Alexander's heart, confirmation that the invisible countdown had already begun. Once Christopher was settled in his private chambers, Alexander retreated to his study and immediately called Dr. Hartwell. She arrived within the hour, slipping through the palace's service entrance to avoid attracting attention from the staff or media. "The symptoms are progressing exactly as we expected," she confirmed after examining Christopher, who had fallen asleep despite his earlier claims of just being tired. "The headaches, the balance issues, the fatigue, these are all consistent with the early stages. We're looking at the beginning of a more noticeable decline." Alexander sank into the chair beside Christopher's bed, watching his son's peaceful face in the dim lamplight. How long before he realizes something is seriously wrong? "Based on the progression rates we discussed, I'd estimate another month, perhaps 2 at the outside," Dr. Hartwell said gently. "The symptoms will become too pronounced to dismiss as minor illnesses or stress. His coordination will continue to deteriorate, his speech may begin to show slight changes, and the headaches will likely increase in frequency and intensity."
"And there's still no treatment?"
"No experimental therapy we haven't explored." Dr. Hartwell placed a compassionate hand on Alexander's shoulder. "Your Majesty, I've consulted with every specialist I can reach. The research is ongoing, but this particular condition, it's too rare, too aggressive. The few experimental treatments that exist are still years away from human trials, and even then, they're designed to slow progression, not reverse it. Alexander nodded, but inside he felt something fundamental breaking apart. He had built his entire life around solving problems, around finding solutions and taking action. The concept of complete powerlessness was foreign to him, yet here he sat, watching his son sleep, knowing that love and determination and royal resources meant nothing in the face of genetic inevitability. After Dr. Hartwell left, Alexander remained in Christopher's room, settling into the armchair he had occupied during his son's childhood illnesses. He remembered nights when Christopher was young, sitting in this same spot while his son battled fevers or nightmares, feeling like a protective guardian who could chase away any threat. Now the threat came from within Christopher's own body, and all Alexander could do was bear witness to its slow destruction of everything he held dear. As dawn approached, Alexander must have dozed off in the chair because he was awakened by Christopher's voice calling his name. His son was sitting up in bed, looking confused and concerned. "Father, what are you doing here? Are you all right?" The question struck Alexander as profoundly ironic. Here was his dying son, worried about him. The role reversal felt like another twist of the knife that seemed to be permanently lodged in his chest. "I heard you moving around during the night and wanted to make sure you were feeling better," Alexander lied smoothly. "How are the headaches this morning?" Christopher tested his balance as he got out of bed, moving more carefully than usual. "Better, I think. Though I still feel a bit unsteady. Perhaps I should see Dr. Hartwell today just to be safe." "I'll arrange it," Alexander said, knowing that Dr. Hartwell would have to perform the delicate dance of acknowledging Christopher's symptoms without revealing the true diagnosis. They had discussed this scenario. She would treat the symptoms, recommend rest and stress reduction, and gradually prepare Christopher for more comprehensive testing when the time came to reveal the truth. Over the following days, Alexander found himself making subtle changes to Christopher's schedule and activities. He canceled the prince's upcoming horseback riding lessons, citing concerns about the autumn weather. He postponed several public appearances, claiming they needed to focus on Christopher's academic preparation. Each cancellation felt like another small surrender to the disease, another acknowledgement of the limitations that were slowly closing in around his son's life. The hardest moments came during their evening conversations, when Christopher would discuss his plans for the future with undiminished enthusiasm. He talked about his upcoming interview at the Royal Military Academy, about the diplomatic mission he hoped to undertake the following year, about the changes he wanted to make when he eventually became king. Alexander listened to each dream, each aspiration, knowing they would never be fulfilled, and somehow managed to respond with encouragement and pride. "I've been thinking about what kind of king I want to be," Christopher said one evening, as they walked through the palace gardens. His pace was noticeably slower than it had been just weeks earlier, though he attributed his careful steps to the wet leaves scattered along the path. "I want to be more accessible than previous generations, more connected to the people. I want to modernize some of our traditions while preserving the ones that truly matter." "Those are noble goals," Alexander replied, his throat tight with emotion. "What specific changes would you want to implement?" Christopher's eyes lit up with passion as he described his vision. Technology initiatives to connect the monarchy with younger citizens, environmental conservation programs, educational reforms that would benefit underprivileged children throughout the kingdom. His ideas were thoughtful, progressive, and deeply compassionate reflections of a young man who truly wanted to serve his people and leave the world better than he found it. As they returned to the palace, Christopher stumbled slightly on the steps, catching himself against the stone railing. "These old steps are getting slippery with the autumn weather," he said with a laugh that didn't quite mask his concern about his own coordination. "Perhaps we should have the grounds crew check the railings," Alexander suggested, playing along with the pretense while his heart shattered a little more. "We can't have you taking a tumble before your academy interview." That night, after Christopher had gone to bed, Alexander sat in his study and wrote a letter that he would never send. It was addressed to his son, filled with all the things he wanted to say but couldn't, all the pride and love and desperate grief that he carried in silence. He wrote about Christopher's compassion, his intelligence, his natural leadership abilities, and the profound impact he had already made on everyone around him. He wrote about regrets and missed opportunities, about the conversations they should have, and the experiences they would never share. When he finished writing, Alexander carefully folded the letter and placed it in his desk drawer alongside the growing collection of similar letters he had written over the past weeks. Perhaps someday, when the truth could no longer be hidden, and when Christopher needed to understand how deeply he was loved, these letters would serve as testimony to a father's devotion. The charade was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain, not just emotionally but practically. Alexander found himself constantly vigilant, watching for signs of progression, making excuses for Christopher's growing limitations, and coordinating with Dr. Hartwell to manage the symptoms without raising suspicions. He felt like an actor in a play, where he was the only one who knew the tragic ending, forced to perform hope and normalcy while his world collapsed around him. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of the secret was the isolation it created. Alexander had always been able to confide in his closest advisors, to share the burdens of leadership with trusted counselors and friends. Now he carried the heaviest burden of his life completely alone, unable to seek comfort or support without risking Christopher's emotional well-being. As October turned to November, and as Christopher's symptoms became more pronounced despite their attempts to explain them away, Alexander knew that the time for revelation was approaching. Dr. Hartwell had been gently suggesting that they needed to prepare Christopher for the truth, that hiding the diagnosis would soon become impossible and potentially harmful. But every time Alexander tried to imagine that conversation, every time he attempted to find the words that would explain the unexplainable and destroy the dreams that gave his son such joy, his courage failed him completely. How do you tell someone you love more than life itself that their life is ending? How do you steal away hope and replace it with despair? How do you become the messenger of fate's cruelest joke? These questions haunted Alexander's days and tormented his nights, creating a prison of secrecy and sorrow from which there seemed to be no escape. He was a king without a kingdom, a father without hope, a man facing the impossible task of loving someone enough to break their heart with the truth. The morning that would change everything arrived with deceptive serenity. November had settled over Ravenshire Palace like a gray blanket, and the ancient walls seemed to absorb the weak sunlight, leaving the corridors dimmed and melancholy. Alexander had spent another sleepless night reviewing medical journals and research papers, desperately searching for something, anything, that might offer even the smallest glimmer of hope. His study desk was now covered with international correspondence from specialists, experimental treatment protocols, and clinical trial information, none of it offering the miracle he sought. Christopher had been experiencing increasingly difficult mornings, taking longer to get dressed due to his deteriorating fine motor skills, though he attributed the clumsiness to fatigue and stress from his academic preparations. Dr. Hartwell had begun visiting the palace more frequently, ostensibly for routine checkups, but actually to monitor the disease's progression and help manage Christopher's symptoms without revealing their true cause. The breaking point came during what should have been an ordinary breakfast. Alexander was reviewing some diplomatic correspondence, while Christopher worked on an essay for his history tutor, both of them maintaining the comfortable companionship that had defined their relationship since Isabella's death. The morning routine had become precious to Alexander, these quiet moments before the day's responsibilities claimed their attention. When he could pretend that nothing had changed, Christopher was attempting to write notes in the margin of his textbook when his hand began to shake uncontrollably. The tremor started small, barely noticeable, but within seconds it had become so pronounced that he dropped his pen entirely. Alexander looked up just in time to see his son staring at his own hand with a mixture of confusion and growing alarm. "Father," Christopher said, his voice carefully controlled but tinged with fear, "something's wrong with my hand." Alexander's heart stopped. This was the moment he had been dreading for weeks, the moment when Christopher's symptoms could no longer be dismissed or explained away. The tremor was a new development, one that Dr. Hartwell had warned might appear as the disease progressed into its next stage. "Let me see," Alexander said, moving to his son's side with forced calm. Christopher held out his hand, and they both watched as the tremor continued, his fingers shaking with a rhythm that seemed to have its own cruel logic. "It started a few minutes ago," Christopher explained, his analytical mind already working to understand what was happening to him. "I was writing, and suddenly I couldn't control the pen. And Father, my vision seems a bit strange this morning. Things appear slightly blurred around the edges." The visual disturbances were another symptom Dr. Hartwell had mentioned, another sign that the disease was advancing, according to its merciless timeline. Alexander felt the weight of weeks of deception pressing down on him as he looked into his son's eyes and saw the first flicker of real fear. "We should have Dr. Hartwell examine you immediately," Alexander said, reaching for his phone. "This could be any number of things: stress, fatigue, perhaps a minor infection affecting your nervous system." But even as he spoke the reassuring words, Alexander could see that Christopher was beginning to connect the dots. His son was brilliant, trained to think analytically and solve complex problems. The tremor, combined with the ongoing headaches, balance issues, and now visual disturbances, was forming a pattern that even a 15-year-old could recognize as seriously concerning. Dr. Hartwell arrived within 30 minutes, and Alexander watched helplessly as she conducted a thorough examination of Christopher in the palace medical suite. She tested his reflexes, his coordination, his vision, and his cognitive responses, all while maintaining a professional demeanor that concealed the devastating knowledge she shared with Alexander. "Prince Christopher," she said finally, settling into a chair across from the examination table, "I'm going to recommend some additional testing. The combination of symptoms you've been experiencing could indicate several different conditions, and we need to conduct a more comprehensive evaluation to determine exactly what we're dealing with." "What kind of conditions?" Christopher asked directly, his royal training in diplomacy and negotiation evident even in this medical context. "I appreciate your caution, Dr. Hartwell, but I need to understand what you're thinking. These symptoms, they're not normal, are they?" Alexander saw Dr. Hartwell glance at him briefly, a silent question about how much to reveal. They had discussed this scenario, but now that it was happening, now that Christopher was asking direct questions with that sharp intelligence that made him such a promising future leader, the carefully planned responses seemed inadequate. "No, Christopher, they're not normal for someone your age and in your physical condition," Dr. Hartwell said honestly. "The combination of neurological symptoms you're experiencing does require investigation. I want to arrange for some specialized testing at London Medical Center, potentially including advanced imaging and some consultations with neurological specialists." Christopher absorbed this information with remarkable composure, but Alexander could see the fear growing behind his son's eyes. "Neurological specialists," Christopher repeated thoughtfully. "Are you concerned about something specific? A brain tumor, perhaps, or some kind of degenerative condition?" The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Alexander felt the room spinning around him, knowing that they had reached the moment when the truth could no longer be avoided. Dr. Hartwell looked at him again, and in her eyes he saw the professional recommendation that had been building for weeks. It was time to tell Christopher everything. "Son," Alexander said, his voice catching slightly, "perhaps we should discuss this privately." Something in his father's tone must have conveyed the gravity of the situation, because Christopher's composure faltered for the first time. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly, looking back and forth between Alexander and Dr. Hartwell. "This isn't the first conversation you've had about my condition, is it?" The perceptiveness of the question revealed just how much Christopher had been observing and analyzing. Despite their attempts to shield him from the truth, Alexander realized that his son had probably noticed the changes in routine, the canceled activities, the worried glances, and the increased medical attention, and had been drawing his own conclusions. "Christopher," Alexander began, but his son held up a hand to stop him. "Please," Christopher said, his voice steady but his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Just tell me the truth. Whatever it is, I need to know." Alexander looked at Dr. Hartwell, who nodded encouragingly, and then back at his son. The weight of weeks of secrecy, of sleepless nights and hidden grief, suddenly felt unbearable. But more than that, he realized that Christopher deserved the truth, deserved the opportunity to face his diagnosis with the same courage and dignity that had always defined his character. "3 weeks ago," Alexander said slowly, "Dr. Hartwell brought me the results of some tests we had run during your last routine physical. The results they indicated that you have a rare genetic condition affecting your nervous system." Christopher's face went very still, but he didn't look away. "What kind of condition?" Dr. Hartwell leaned forward. "It's called juvenile onset neurological degeneration syndrome. It's extremely rare, affecting fewer than 1 in several million people. The condition causes progressive deterioration of motor function, coordination, and eventually other neurological processes." "Progressive," Christopher repeated, his analytical mind immediately grasping the implications. "Meaning it gets worse over time."
"Yes," Dr. Hartwell confirmed gently.
"And the prognosis?" Christopher's voice remained steady, though Alexander could see his hands trembling more pronounced now. Whether from the disease or from emotional stress, Alexander felt as though his heart was being torn from his chest, but he forced himself to answer his son's direct question honestly. "The specialists believe they estimate 18 months to 2 years. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the palace walls seemed to hold their breath as Christopher absorbed the information that would redefine every aspect of his existence. Alexander watched his son's face cycle through emotions: shock, disbelief, fear, and then, amazingly, a kind of calm acceptance that spoke to the inner strength that had always made Christopher extraordinary.
18 months, Christopher said finally, his voice barely above a whisper.
"So, I'm dying," Christopher Alexander started, but his son shook his head. "It's all right, Father. I mean, it's not all right, obviously, but I understand." Christopher was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands as the tremor continued. "The military academy interview next month, there's no point in that now, is there?" The practical question, delivered with such matter-of-fact acceptance, broke something inside Alexander. All the plans they had made, all the dreams Christopher had shared, all the future they had envisioned together, it was all dissolving in the space of this single conversation.
"We don't have to make any immediate decisions," Dr.
Hartwell said gently. The progression varies from person to person, and there may still be treatments or therapies that could help manage symptoms and potentially slow the advancement. Christopher nodded, but Alexander could see that his son was already thinking beyond medical possibilities to practical realities. "The succession," Christopher said, looking directly at his father, "this changes everything about the succession." Alexander hadn't even considered the constitutional implications until that moment, too focused on the personal devastation to think about matters of state. But Christopher was right. The diagnosis would require immediate consultation with the Prime Minister, the Cabinet, and the constitutional advisors. Laws would need to be reviewed, succession protocols examined, and plans put in place for a future that no longer included Christopher as the heir apparent. "We'll handle all of that later," Alexander said firmly. "Right now, the only thing that matters is you, and making sure you have everything you need to fight this." Christopher attempted a smile, though it was tinged with sadness. "Fight what, Father?" "From what Dr. Hartwell is describing, this isn't a battle I can win through determination or good planning. This is just biology taking its course." The mature acceptance in his son's voice was both inspiring and heartbreaking. At 15, Christopher was demonstrating a wisdom and grace that many adults never achieved, even when facing their own mortality. "There are still things we can do," Dr. Hartwell interjected. "Physical therapy to maintain function as long as possible, medications to manage symptoms, and various treatments to ensure comfort and quality of life. The diagnosis doesn't mean giving up. It means adapting our approach and focusing on making the most of the time available." "Time," Christopher mused, looking out the window at the palace gardens where autumn was giving way to the stark beauty of approaching winter. "I suppose time becomes different when you know how much of it you have left." Alexander wanted to collapse under the weight of his son's philosophical acceptance, wanted to rage against the unfairness of genetics and fate, wanted to demand that the universe provide a different ending to this story. Instead, he reached over and took Christopher's hand, tremor and all, holding it firmly in his own. "We'll face this together," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion. "Whatever comes, whatever we need to do, we'll do it together." Christopher squeezed his father's hand as much as his deteriorating condition allowed.
I know, Father.
"And I'm grateful for that. But I think I need some time alone right now to process all of this." As Christopher left the medical suite, walking with the careful dignity that had always characterized his public appearances, Alexander finally allowed the tears he had been holding back for weeks to fall. Dr. Hartwell placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, but no words were spoken. What comfort could there be for a father who had just watched his son receive a death sentence with more grace and strength than he himself possessed? The secret was finally out, but rather than relief, Alexander felt only the crushing weight of confirmed reality. The nightmare was no longer hidden. It was acknowledged, shared, and utterly devastatingly real. The afternoon following Christopher's diagnosis revelation brought an unexpected transformation to Ravenshire Palace. While Alexander had anticipated his son would retreat into despair or anger, Christopher instead emerged from his private chambers 3 hours later with a sense of purpose that both amazed and concerned his father. The young prince had spent the time alone, not wallowing in self-pity, but creating what he called his legacy plan, a detailed outline of everything he wanted to accomplish in the time remaining to him. Alexander found Christopher in the palace library, surrounded by notebooks, history books, and his laptop, working with an intensity that seemed almost fever-driven. The tremor in his hands had subsided somewhat, though Dr. Hartwell had warned that the symptoms would fluctuate in the early stages before becoming more consistently pronounced. "I've been thinking," Christopher said without looking up from his writing, "about how I want to spend whatever time I have left. If I'm going to die, I want my death to mean something. I want to leave something behind that will help people, that will make the kingdom better than it was before I got sick." The matter-of-fact way Christopher discussed his own mortality was simultaneously inspiring and heartbreaking. Alexander sat down across from his son, noting the carefully organized piles of papers and the detailed lists Christopher had been compiling. "What kind of legacy are you thinking about?" Alexander asked, trying to match his son's practical tone while his heart ached with every word. Christopher looked up, his eyes bright with the same enthusiasm that had always driven his academic pursuits and royal training. "I want to establish a foundation focused on rare disease research, but not just any foundation. I want it to be revolutionary in how it approaches funding and research coordination. Most rare disease research fails because there aren't enough patients to study and not enough money to fund comprehensive studies. But what if we created a new model? As Christopher outlined his vision, Alexander began to understand the scope of his son's ambition. The foundation would use Christopher's royal status and the sympathy his diagnosis would generate to raise unprecedented amounts of funding. More importantly, it would coordinate research efforts across international boundaries, sharing data and resources in ways that had never been attempted before. I've been researching similar conditions, Christopher continued, pulling up documents on his laptop. There are dozens of rare genetic disorders that affect children and young adults, each one studied in isolation, each one receiving minimal funding because the patient populations are so small. But if we could create a collaborative network, pooling resources and data across multiple conditions, we might be able to accelerate research for all of them. Alexander was struck by the sophistication of Christopher's thinking. Even facing his own death, his son was focusing on how to prevent other families from enduring similar devastation. It was the kind of visionary leadership that would have made Christopher an exceptional king, and now it would serve as his final gift to the world. There's more, Christopher said, flipping through his handwritten notes. I want to document everything about this disease as it progresses in me. I want to keep detailed records of symptoms, treatments, quality of life measures, everything. Most rare disease research relies on small numbers of patients studied retrospectively, but I could provide a complete, real-time case study from someone with access to the best medical care available. The idea of his son treating his own deterioration as a research opportunity was both admirable and devastating to Alexander. Christopher, you don't have to turn yourself into a medical experiment. Yes, I do, Christopher replied firmly. This is the most useful thing I can do with my situation. I have advantages that other patients don't access to specialists, resources for treatment, and a platform to publicize the research. If my death is inevitable, then I want my life and my dying to save other people. Over the following days, Christopher threw himself into developing his foundation with the same dedication he had once applied to his royal studies. He corresponded with researchers across Europe and America, learning about current research limitations and funding gaps. He met with legal advisors to establish the foundation's structure, ensuring it could continue operating long after his death. He even began working with public relations specialists to develop a media strategy that would maximize awareness and donations. Alexander watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and profound sadness. Christopher had found a way to maintain dignity and purpose in the face of terminal illness, but the cost was the loss of simply being a teenager. There were no more casual conversations about friends or school or trivial concerns. Every moment had become precious, every action measured against its potential contribution to the legacy Christopher was determined to create. The most difficult aspect was Christopher's insistence on transparency about his condition. Against Alexander's protective instincts, his son wanted to make his diagnosis public, to use his royal status to bring attention to rare disease research. This meant preparing for media scrutiny, public sympathy, and the end of any privacy they might have hoped to maintain during Christopher's illness. The announcement should be honest but hopeful, Christopher explained during a meeting with the palace communications team. We need to acknowledge the prognosis, while emphasizing the research opportunities and the foundation's potential impact. People need to understand that this isn't just a tragedy, it's a call to action. Alexander struggled with every aspect of the public revelation. His instinct was to protect his son, to shield him from public attention during his illness, to preserve some sanctuary where Christopher could face his diagnosis away from cameras and public scrutiny. But Christopher was adamant that privacy was a luxury they couldn't afford if they wanted to maximize the foundation's impact. Father, Christopher said during one of their evening discussions, I know this is hard for you. It's hard for me too. But if we keep this private, if we handle this quietly, then I die and nothing changes. Other children will get these diseases, other families will face what we're facing, and the research will continue to move at the same slow pace because there's no urgency, no public awareness, no significant funding. The logic was unassailable, but it required Alexander to watch his son transform from a protected royal heir into a public advocate for his own terminal condition. Christopher began giving interviews with medical journalists, speaking at rare disease conferences via video link, and corresponding with patient advocacy groups around the world. Each public appearance showcased his intelligence and dedication, while also documenting the subtle progression of his symptoms. During a particularly poignant interview with a children's medical charity, Christopher was asked about his emotional state regarding his diagnosis. Alexander watched from behind the cameras as his son answered with characteristic honesty. I won't pretend I'm not afraid, Christopher said. his slight tremor more noticeable under the bright studio lights. I am afraid. I'm afraid of pain, of losing my abilities, of leaving my father alone. But I'm also excited about what we might accomplish. This foundation has the potential to change how rare disease research is conducted globally. If my diagnosis leads to treatments that save other children, then my life will have had extraordinary meaning. The interviewer, clearly moved, asked about Christopher's relationship with his father during this difficult time. My father is the strongest person I know, Christopher replied, looking directly into the camera, as if speaking to Alexander personally. He's been carrying the weight of my diagnosis in secret for weeks, trying to protect me from reality while dealing with his own grief. Now that we're facing this together, openly, I see how much courage it takes for him to support my decisions about going public, about the foundation, about all of it. He's teaching me how to be brave in the face of something that terrifies both of us. After the interview, Alexander found himself unable to speak. Christopher's public praise of his strength felt undeserved when he felt so powerless, so broken by circumstances beyond his control. But he began to understand that Christopher needed to see him as strong, needed to believe that his father could handle whatever came next. Because that belief was part of what gave Christopher the courage to face his own deterioration with such grace. As winter settled over the kingdom, the foundation began to take concrete shape. Major donors responded to Christopher's personal appeals with unprecedented generosity. Research institutions across 3 continents agreed to participate in collaborative studies. Patient advocacy groups embraced the new model of coordinated research and data sharing. Within 6 weeks of going public with his diagnosis, Christopher had established what medical experts were already calling a revolutionary approach to rare disease research. But the professional success came at a personal cost. Christopher's symptoms were advancing more rapidly than Dr. Hartwell had initially predicted. The tremor in his hands had become constant, his handwriting was deteriorating, and he had begun experiencing episodes of severe fatigue that left him exhausted for hours after minor activities. Each new symptom was documented methodically for the research database, but it also represented another piece of the son Alexander loved disappearing bit by bit. The most devastating development came during a family dinner in early December. Christopher was attempting to cut his food when his hand coordination failed completely, sending his knife clattering across his plate. For a moment, he stared at his hands with the same confusion Alexander had seen weeks earlier. But now there was acceptance in his expression along with the frustration. "It's progressing faster," Christopher said matter-of-factly. "Dr. Hartwell warned this might happen. We should probably discuss practical adjustments to my daily routine." Alexander wanted to rage against the clinical way his son discussed his own deterioration, wanted to demand that Christopher allow himself to be angry or scared or heartbroken about what was happening to him. Instead, he helped cut his son's food and listened as Christopher analyzed the implications of declining motor function for his foundation work and public appearances.
I can still type more easily than write by hand, Christopher noted.
"So we should focus on digital communications for the foundation. And I should probably record video messages for future use while my speech is still clear, in case the foundation needs my personal testimony later." The practical planning for his own incapacitation demonstrated Christopher's remarkable maturity, but it also highlighted the impossible position Alexander found himself in. How do you celebrate your son's wisdom and strength while grieving the circumstances that forced him to develop such qualities? How do you support his determination to make a difference while wanting desperately to protect him from the realities that drove that determination? As December progressed and Christopher's condition continued to deteriorate, Alexander began to understand that his role had fundamentally changed. He was no longer just a father trying to protect his child. He was a partner in Christopher's mission to transform his dying into something meaningful, something that would outlast the brevity of his life and serve as a testament to the extraordinary person he had become in the face of impossible circumstances. The new year arrived with a bitter irony that wasn't lost on either Alexander or Christopher. January traditionally brought fresh beginnings and hopeful resolutions, but for the royal family it marked the one-year countdown that Dr. Hartwell's most optimistic projections had established. Christopher's condition had progressed more rapidly than anyone had anticipated, and the symptoms that had been subtle in October were now impossible to ignore or explain away. Captain Marcus Sterling had become an unexpected confidant during this period, his years of loyal service and natural discretion making him one of the few people who could witness the family's private struggle without judgment. He had watched Christopher adapt to using voice recognition software when his handwriting became illegible, had seen him struggle with buttons and zippers until his clothes were replaced with easier alternatives, and had observed the young prince's determined effort to maintain his royal duties even as his body betrayed him. The foundation had achieved remarkable success in its first few months of operation. Christopher's personal story and the royal family's unprecedented openness about genetic disease had captured international attention, resulting in research funding that exceeded their most ambitious goals. 3 major pharmaceutical companies had committed to collaborative rare disease research programs, and a dozen universities had established Christopher Ravenshire Research Fellows positions, specifically focused on pediatric neurological conditions. But success came with the cruel reality of watching its architect gradually lose the abilities that had made his advocacy so compelling. Christopher's public appearances were now limited to carefully scheduled video conferences, and even those required significant preparation and recovery time. His speech, while still clear, had begun to show the slight slurring that Dr. Hartwell had warned would eventually make communication impossible. Alexander spent his days managing 2 parallel realities: the public face of strength and hope that the foundation required, and the private heartbreak of watching his son disappear by degrees. Each morning brought new challenges as Christopher's condition forced adaptations to routines that had once been effortless. Each evening brought the exhaustion of maintaining optimism in the face of relentless progression toward an outcome that no amount of love or determination could change. The moment that would define the rest of their journey together came on a gray January afternoon when Christopher asked to speak with his father privately in the palace library. Alexander found him sitting in the wingback chair that had been Isabella's favorite, surrounded by the books that had always been his refuge. Christopher's hands rested motionlessly in his lap, the tremor that had once been intermittent, now constant and pronounced. "Father," Christopher began, his voice carrying a weariness that seemed far beyond his 16 years, "I need to ask you to help me with something that's going to be very difficult for both of us." Alexander settled into the chair across from his son, noting the careful way Christopher had positioned himself to minimize the visible effects of his condition. Even in private, even with his own father, Christopher maintained the dignity and composure that had always characterized his public presence. "I want to record a series of final messages," Christopher continued, "for the foundation, for the research community, for the royal family, and for you. I want to do this while I can still speak clearly, while I can still articulate my thoughts the way I want to." The request hit Alexander like a physical blow. The idea of helping his son prepare his own farewell messages felt like collaborating in his death, like accepting defeat in a battle they hadn't yet lost. But looking into Christopher's eyes, Alexander saw the same determined logic that had driven every decision his son had made since learning his diagnosis. The research data shows that speech deterioration accelerates rapidly once it begins. Christopher explained with the clinical detachment he had developed when discussing his condition. "I have maybe 2 months before communication becomes significantly impaired. If I wait until I feel ready emotionally, I'll wait too long practically." Over the following week, Alexander found himself serving as both director and witness as Christopher methodically recorded his legacy. They filmed in the same library where Christopher had spent countless hours studying, surrounded by the books and artifacts that represented centuries of Ravenshire history. Christopher spoke directly into the camera with the same natural authority he had always possessed, as if death were simply another audience to command. His message to the Foundation's research partners was both practical and inspiring, outlining specific goals for the coming years and emphasizing the importance of maintaining collaborative relationships across institutional boundaries. He spoke about the data his case had provided, the lessons learned from his treatment protocols, and the gaps in research that still needed to be addressed. "The goal has never been to save my life," Christopher said in one particularly moving segment. "The goal has been to use my life and my death to save others. If this foundation prevents even one family from facing what my father and I have endured, then everything we've done will have been worthwhile." His message to the royal family was more personal but equally composed. He spoke about duty, tradition, and the responsibility that came with inherited privilege. He discussed the constitutional changes his death would necessitate, offering thoughtful suggestions for how the monarchy might adapt and modernize in his absence. "The crown represents continuity," Christopher said, looking directly into the camera. "It represents the idea that something larger than any individual person can endure across generations. My death doesn't diminish that continuity, it reinforces it. The crown will continue to serve our people long after I'm gone, and that knowledge gives meaning to my life, even if that life is shorter than any of us would have chosen." But it was Christopher's final message to his father that broke through the careful emotional control Alexander had maintained throughout the filming process. Christopher had insisted on recording this segment alone, with only the camera as witness, though he asked Alexander to watch the recording immediately afterward. "Father," Christopher's voice filled the library where they had shared so many conversations, By the time you watch this, I'll either be gone or unable to communicate clearly. I need you to know that every moment of my life has been made better by your love and guidance. You've shown me what it means to serve others, what it means to carry responsibility with grace, and what it means to love someone more than your own comfort or happiness. Alexander had to pause the recording as tears blurred his vision, but Christopher's voice continued with gentle authority. I know you blame yourself for not being able to save me. I know you feel powerless in a way that goes against everything you've been taught about leadership and problem solving. But Father, you have saved me. You've saved me from facing this alone, from feeling unloved or unworthy, from dying without purpose. You've helped me create something that will outlast my life and help other children. That's not powerlessness. That's the greatest gift one person can give another. The recording continued for another 10 minutes, with Christopher sharing specific memories, expressing gratitude for experiences they had shared, and offering comfort for the grief he knew Alexander would carry. It was simultaneously the most devastating and most beautiful thing Alexander had ever experienced. A final gift from a son who understood that his father would need these words in the dark days ahead. As winter deepened and Christopher's condition continued its relentless progression, the Foundation announced its most significant achievement, a collaborative research initiative involving 37 institutions across 6 countries, all working together to develop treatments for rare genetic diseases affecting children. The announcement was made through a pre-recorded video message from Christopher, filmed during one of his better days, when his symptoms were less pronounced. But privately, the royal family was dealing with the practical realities of advanced disease progression. Christopher now required assistance with most daily activities. His communication was becoming increasingly difficult, and Dr. Hartwell had begun discussing end-stage care options that no parent should ever have to consider. The conversation that would haunt Alexander for the rest of his life took place on a February evening when Christopher was having a particularly difficult day. His speech was severely impaired, his motor control had deteriorated significantly, and he was experiencing the kind of profound fatigue that left him barely able to stay awake for more than a few hours at a time. Father, Christopher managed to say, his words slurred but still understandable. I need you to promise me something. Alexander leaned closer, taking his son's hand and trying not to focus on how much weight Christopher had lost, how fragile he had become. When the time comes, Christopher continued with enormous effort, don't try to extend my life beyond what's comfortable. The foundation work is done. The research is funded. The message has been delivered. When this disease has taken everything else, don't let it take my dignity too. Alexander wanted to refuse, wanted to promise that he would fight for every possible day, every extra hour, regardless of Christopher's comfort or wishes. But looking into his son's eyes, he saw the same quiet determination that had driven every decision Christopher had made since his diagnosis. This final request wasn't about giving up. It was about maintaining control over the only thing Christopher could still control, the manner of his dying. I promise, Alexander whispered, the words feeling like both a betrayal and an act of love. 2 weeks later, on a March morning when spring was just beginning to touch the palace gardens, Christopher Ravenshire lost consciousness for the final time. He died 3 days afterward, surrounded by his father's love and the knowledge that his brief life had created something lasting and important. The Christopher Ravenshire Foundation for Rare Disease Research would go on to fund breakthrough treatments for dozens of genetic conditions. The collaborative research model he pioneered would be adopted by medical institutions around the world. The data from his case study would contribute to the development of new therapeutic approaches for neurological diseases affecting children. But for Alexander, Christopher's greatest legacy was simpler and more profound. He had shown the world how to face death with dignity, purpose, and grace. He had transformed terminal illness into a platform for service, and he had taught his father that love sometimes means letting go, even when holding on feels like the only choice that matters. In the years that followed, when Alexander spoke about his son at foundation events and research conferences, he always concluded with the same words. Christopher taught me that the length of a life is less important than its depth, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite fear, and that the greatest gift a parent can give a child is the freedom to define their own meaning, even in the face of circumstances that seem meaningless. The boy who should have been king became something greater, a symbol of hope, a catalyst for change, and proof that even the briefest life can cast a shadow long enough to shelter generations of children who will never know his name but will benefit from his sacrifice. Captain Sterling, who remained with the royal family long after Christopher's death, would later say that those final months had revealed the true nature of both father and son. His Majesty learned that a king's greatest power lies not in what he can control, but in how he responds to what he cannot control. And Prince Christopher showed us all that nobility isn't about bloodline or title, it's about choosing to serve others when you have every reason to serve only yourself. The heartbreak remained, as heartbreak always does when love outlasts life. But alongside the grief, Alexander carried the profound pride of having witnessed his son transform dying into a form of victory and loss into a legacy that would endure long after the pain had dulled to a bearable ache. Christopher had not lived long, but he had lived fully, and in the end, that made all the difference.